Sword Art Online is supposed to be an exciting anime filled with action, adventure, romance, drama, and unforgettable characters. At least, that's what I'm constantly told. The series has death games, giant monsters, magical swords, world-ending threats, tragic backstories, and enough dramatic speeches to fill an entire library. And somehow, despite having all of those ingredients, I still find it incredibly boring. I genuinely don't understand how an anime can throw this many supposedly exciting things at the screen and still make me feel like I'm watching a PowerPoint presentation with a budget. So today I decided to compare Sword Art Online to something completely different, Hearts2Hearts. Yes, I'm seriously putting a K-pop girl group up against Sword Art Online. And honestly, I don't even think this is as ridiculous of a comparison as it sounds. Because when I ask myself which one I'd rather spend my free time watching, the answer is very easy. Hearts2Hearts? Their music videos are colorful, energetic, stylish, and actually fun to watch. There are interesting visuals, great performances, choreography, different outfits, different sets, and 8 members who actually give me a reason to keep watching. I can press play on a Hearts2Hearts music video and immediately have something entertaining happening in front of me. I don't need 3 episodes of build-up, 15 exposition dumps, or Kirito standing around looking depressed while somebody explains how unbelievably special he is. And that's the funny thing about this comparison. Hearts2Hearts doesn't need a massive fictional universe to entertain me. They don't need a death game where thousands of people are trapped inside a virtual reality. They don't need magical weapons, overpowered protagonists, tragic character deaths, or some ridiculous villain explaining his master plan for 20 minutes. They can just make a music video, perform a song, look good, have fun, and somehow keep my attention better than an anime that was supposedly designed around the idea of being an epic survival adventure. Sword Art Online, meanwhile, has every opportunity to be exciting and still manages to lose me. It's got all the ingredients, it's got the swords, it's got the battles, it's got the romance, it's got the supposedly emotional character moments. It's got characters constantly facing impossible odds, and yet, somehow, I can watch a Hearts2Hearts music video and be more entertained in 3 minutes than I am during an entire Sword Art Online episode. Actually, I think that's what makes Sword Art Online especially frustrating for me. If it were just a boring slice-of-life anime, I'd understand. But Sword Art Online constantly tells me that what I'm watching is supposed to be incredibly important. Every other scene seems to be screaming, "This is epic, this is emotional, this character is really important, you better care." And I'm sitting there thinking, could you please just give me a reason to care, instead of repeatedly announcing that I should? It's like the anime is trying to bully me into being entertained. And then there's Kirito. Oh, Kirito. Somehow this guy can walk into practically any situation, be better than everyone else, save the day, collect another admirer, deliver a dramatic speech, and walk away looking mildly inconvenienced. The story seems to treat him like the human equivalent of a 5-star review. He's smart, he's powerful, he's important, he's cool, and apparently the universe itself has decided that everybody needs to know how amazing he is. So after sitting through all of that, why wouldn't I want to watch Hearts2Hearts instead? At least Hearts2Hearts gives me something I actually enjoy looking at. The music is fun. The members are entertaining, the visuals are interesting, the choreography gives me something else to focus on. I can replay the videos without feeling like I'm punishing myself. I can listen to the songs outside of the videos. I can look up performances and other content. And most importantly, I actually want more. With Sword Art Online, my reaction is usually the exact opposite. When an episode ends, I'm not immediately reaching for the next one because I'm desperate to know what happens. I'm thinking, well, that's another episode I'll never get back. If I have to choose between watching another Sword Art Online episode or watching another Hearts2Hearts music video, I'm picking Hearts2Hearts without hesitation. So yes, this is a completely unfair comparison. I'm putting a K-pop girl group against an anime that supposedly has death games, action, romance, and high-stakes drama. And somehow, Sword Art Online is still losing. Today, I'm going to explain exactly why I find Hearts2Hearts more entertaining than Sword Art Online, why I actually enjoy watching the Hearts2Hearts members, and why their music videos, personalities, chemistry, fandom, and replay value give me far more reasons to keep watching than anything Sword Art Online has ever offered me. Because if a few minutes of a K-pop music video can keep my attention better than an entire anime about surviving a virtual death game, maybe Sword Art Online isn't nearly as entertaining as it thinks it is.
For starters, Hearts2Hearts music videos are simply much more fun to watch. They immediately give you something visually interesting to look at, whether it's the colorful sets, creative styling, choreography, camera work, or the members themselves. There's a constant sense of movement and energy that keeps the video from feeling static. Even when nothing particularly complicated is happening, there's enough going on visually to keep your attention. You can just sit back and enjoy the music, the visuals, and the performance without needing the video to constantly explain itself. And that's something I really appreciate about K-pop music videos in general. They understand that they're supposed to be entertaining. Hearts2Hearts isn't afraid to be colorful, stylish, energetic, or just plain fun. The visuals are designed to grab your attention and keep you engaged from beginning to end. You can watch one of their videos multiple times and still notice little details you didn't catch the first time. There are different outfits, locations, camera angles, choreography moments, and visual effects constantly giving you something new to look at. Sword Art Online, on the other hand, can feel like the complete opposite. This is an anime that constantly wants you to believe you're watching something incredibly dramatic and profound, but I often find myself completely disengaged. There are plenty of scenes that are supposed to feel intense or emotional, yet they don't have nearly the same visual or emotional impact for me. Instead of thinking, wow, this is awesome, I'm more likely to be wondering when the scene is going to end. The biggest difference is the energy. Hearts2Hearts music videos have a sense of excitement that feels immediate. You don't need to wait through several episodes for something interesting to happen. Within a few seconds, you're already getting music, choreography, visuals, and personality. Sword Art Online can spend much longer setting up its supposedly epic moments, only for the payoff to leave me thinking, that's it. And then there's the fact that the Hearts2Hearts members themselves bring a huge amount of personality to the videos. You're not just watching a bunch of characters move around a fictional world. You're watching actual performers who each have their own expressions, styles, and stage presence. That makes the videos much more engaging because there's a human element that keeps pulling your attention back. Even the choreography gives the videos another layer of entertainment. You can focus on the song, watch the choreography, pay attention to individual members, or just enjoy the overall presentation. There's something for you to focus on even if you're not deeply invested in the concept or storyline. Sword Art Online doesn't give me that same feeling. Its characters are supposed to be the main reason you care about what's happening, but I don't find many of them particularly compelling. So when the story slows down or the action disappears, there's not much left to keep me interested. I'm basically waiting for the anime to give me a reason to care again. That's why, for me, Hearts2Hearts wins this comparison pretty easily. Their music videos don't need to convince me that they're masterpieces. They just need to entertain me, and they actually do. They're colorful, energetic, visually appealing, and packed with personality. Sword Art Online, meanwhile, can spend entire episodes trying to convince me that what I'm watching is incredibly important, and I'm still sitting there wondering why I didn't just put on another Hearts2Hearts music video instead. If the goal is simply to ask which one I'd rather spend my free time watching, there's really not much of a competition. Give me a few minutes of Hearts2Hearts over another episode of Sword Art Online any day. Another major reason I find Hearts2Hearts more entertaining is that I actually like the members. And when I say I like them more than the characters in Sword Art Online, I mean that pretty much every single member of Hearts2Hearts is more interesting to me than anyone in Sword Art Online. Honestly, I don't think there's a single Sword Art Online character that I genuinely like. That's obviously my personal opinion, but it makes a huge difference when I'm deciding what I actually want to watch. With Hearts2Hearts, I actually want to learn more about the members. They have different personalities, different appearances, different talents, and different ways of performing. Even when they're simply interacting with each other, there's something enjoyable about watching them because I'm interested in the people I'm actually watching. I don't need some ridiculous death game or world-ending threat to make them entertaining. Their personalities and performances are enough. That's completely different from how I feel about Sword Art Online. I'm supposed to care about characters like Kirito, Asuna, and the rest of the cast, but I've never connected with them. I don't find them particularly interesting, and I certainly don't find myself emotionally attached to them. A character can be given a tragic backstory, an emotional speech, or some supposedly heartbreaking moment, but none of that automatically makes me care about them. If the character isn't compelling in the first place, adding more tragedy on top isn't going to magically fix the problem. And Kirito is probably the biggest example of this for me. He's presented as this incredibly cool, talented, mysterious protagonist who's somehow amazing at practically everything. He's powerful, he's important, he's constantly saving people, and the story seems determined to remind you how special he is. But for me, that doesn't make him interesting. It makes him exhausting. I don't want a character to constantly be treated like the greatest person who has ever touched a keyboard. I want flaws, personality, chemistry, and actual reasons to become invested in them. The same problem extends to the rest of the cast. Sword Art Online introduces characters who are supposed to become important, gives them some dramatic situation, and expects me to immediately care about them. But if I don't find the character interesting outside of whatever tragedy the plot has assigned to them, the emotional moments aren't going to work for me. At some point, you can't just keep throwing sad backstories at me and expect me to suddenly become emotionally invested. With Hearts2Hearts, I don't have that problem because the members don't need to be written into some elaborate fictional storyline for me to enjoy watching them. They're performers. Their personalities, chemistry, music, choreography, and individual presence are already enough to make me interested in them. I can watch them perform and actually have fun instead of constantly waiting for the story to convince me why I'm supposed to care. And that's really the biggest difference for me. Hearts2Hearts gives me people I actually want to watch, while Sword Art Online gives me fictional characters I simply don't enjoy. I don't dislike one or two Sword Art Online characters while loving everyone else. I genuinely don't like any of them. So, when the anime spends a huge amount of time trying to make me care about its cast, it becomes almost impossible for me to get invested. Meanwhile, I can put on a Hearts2Hearts music video and immediately enjoy watching the members perform. I like seeing their personalities come through, I like their interactions, and I actually want to see what they'll do next. That's a much stronger connection than anything I've ever felt toward the Sword Art Online cast. So, if I'm choosing between spending my time watching Hearts2Hearts members I actually enjoy or watching a cast of Sword Art Online characters that I don't like at all, that's not really a difficult decision for me. Hearts2Hearts wins that one by a ridiculous margin. Another big reason I prefer Hearts2Hearts is the replay value. Their music videos are actually something I can come back to. I can watch the same video multiple times and still enjoy it because I'm not necessarily watching it for one specific story. I can come back for the song, the choreography, the visuals, the outfits, a particular member, or just because I genuinely enjoy the overall experience. Even after I've already seen the video, there's still something enjoyable about putting it on again. And K-pop music videos are especially good for this because there are so many little details you can notice on repeat viewings. Maybe you're paying attention to the choreography the first time, then you notice the styling the next time, then you focus on a different member, and then you catch some visual detail you completely missed before. You can watch the same music video several times without it feeling exactly the same, because there's always something else to focus on. Sword Art Online has basically none of that for me. Once I've watched it, why would I ever want to watch it again? I already know what's going to happen. I don't particularly like the characters, and I don't find the story entertaining enough to make me want to experience it a second time. There's no mystery pulling me back, no characters I desperately want to spend more time with, and no emotional attachment that makes me think, I need to experience this again. And that's a pretty serious problem for an anime that wants to be this grand, emotional, epic experience. If I finish an entire series and my biggest reaction is, well, I'm glad that's over, you've probably lost the replayability argument completely. There's a huge difference between finishing something and immediately wanting to watch it again versus finishing it and feeling like you've just completed an obligation. Even the supposedly iconic moments don't make me want to go back. If anything, knowing what's coming makes them less interesting because I'm already aware of where everything is heading. And since I don't particularly enjoy the characters in the first place, revisiting their biggest emotional moments doesn't suddenly make me care about them more. It just means I'm watching scenes I already didn't like a second time. With Hearts2Hearts, it's the complete opposite. I can put on a music video whenever I feel like it, enjoy the song, watch the members perform, appreciate the visuals, and move on. There's no commitment required. I don't have to sit through dozens of episodes just to get to something entertaining. I can spend 3 or 4 minutes watching something I genuinely enjoy, and then come back to it whenever I want. That's what makes replay value so important to me. Entertainment should make you want to come back. If I enjoy something, I shouldn't have to convince myself to watch it again. I should actually want to. And I have that feeling with Hearts2Hearts. I don't have that feeling with Sword Art Online at all. Honestly, if I had the choice between rewatching a Hearts2Hearts music video for the 10th time or rewatching Sword Art Online from the beginning, I'm picking Hearts2Hearts without even thinking about it. At least the music video gives me something I actually enjoy. With Sword Art Online, I'd just be sitting there thinking about how much I'd rather be watching something else. Another reason I prefer Hearts2Hearts is the fandom and community surrounding the group. From my experience, the Hearts2Hearts community feels much more welcoming and enjoyable to be around. There's a lot of excitement surrounding the members, their music, performances, and future releases, and it feels like people are actually there because they genuinely enjoy supporting the group. You can talk about your favorite member, share edits, discuss performances, recommend songs, and get excited about new content without everything immediately turning into some ridiculous argument. There's also something really fun about being part of a newer fandom. Everyone is discovering things together. People are learning the members' personalities, figuring out their favorite songs, sharing clips, making memes, and watching the group develop over time. There's a sense that you're actually experiencing the group's growth alongside everyone else. That makes the community itself part of the entertainment. Sword Art Online, on the other hand, has one of the most exhausting fandoms I've ever encountered. Obviously, not every Sword Art Online fan is toxic, and I'm not going to pretend every individual person in the fandom is terrible. But the community has a reputation for being extremely defensive, argumentative, and hostile toward criticism, and that has absolutely affected my experience with it. You can't simply say that you dislike the anime without someone appearing out of nowhere to write an entire dissertation explaining why you're objectively wrong. And that's especially annoying when you're someone like me who genuinely hates Sword Art Online. I don't dislike one particular season or think one arc was weaker than another. I dislike the series as a whole. So when someone tells me that I just don't understand Sword Art Online or that I need to watch another 100 episodes before I'm qualified to criticize it, it becomes pretty exhausting. Apparently, disliking an anime requires a certification now. The funniest part is that the fandom can sometimes be more aggressive about defending Sword Art Online than the actual show is about defending itself. You can criticize the writing, characters, romance, pacing, or basically anything else, and suddenly you've summoned an army of people ready to explain why you're secretly wrong. At that point, you're not even discussing the anime anymore. You're participating in a courtroom trial where the only crime is saying, "I don't like Sword Art Online." Meanwhile, the Hearts2Hearts community is much more appealing to me because I can actually participate without feeling like I'm walking into a battlefield. I can talk about the members I like, share my favorite songs, discuss music videos, and enjoy the group's content without constantly having to defend my opinion against people who treat criticism like a personal attack. That's a huge part of what makes a fandom enjoyable. The community should make you more excited about the thing you're a fan of, not make you regret mentioning it. If I finish watching a Hearts2Hearts video and want to go online and see what everyone else thought about it, that's a good sign. If I watch Sword Art Online and then think, I'd rather not interact with that fandom, that's a completely different experience. And honestly, when I compare the two communities, Hearts2Hearts wins for me pretty easily. I'd much rather spend my time around people who are excited about music, performances, and the members than people who are ready to start a 40-comment argument because I said their favorite anime isn't very good. So even beyond the music and the music videos themselves, the fandom makes a difference. Hearts2Hearts gives me a community I actually want to be part of. Sword Art Online gives me a community that, from my perspective, can feel incredibly defensive and unwelcoming toward anyone who doesn't worship the series. And if I'm going to spend my free time talking about something online, I'll take the fandom that actually makes the experience more enjoyable. I think the biggest difference between Hearts2Hearts and Sword Art Online is what happens after I'm finished watching. With Hearts2Hearts, I actually want more. I'll finish a music video and immediately want to watch another one. Maybe I'll listen to another song, look up another performance, watch some behind-the-scenes content, or search for clips of my favorite members. There's always something else I can go watch, and I actually want to keep exploring the group. The content makes me curious about what comes next. That's probably the strongest argument I can make for why I find Hearts to Hearts more entertaining. When I enjoy something, I naturally want more of it. I don't have to force myself to continue. I'm not watching the clock and wondering when it's going to end. I'm actively choosing to watch another video because I genuinely enjoy the members, the music, and the overall experience. Sword Art Online gives me the exact opposite reaction. When I finish an episode, I'm not thinking, wow, I can't wait to see what happens next. I'm thinking, thank God that's over. And that's a pretty massive problem when you're dealing with a series that is supposed to be entertaining. If your audience is constantly relieved when an episode ends, maybe the problem isn't the audience. There's nothing about Sword Art Online that makes me desperately want more of it. I don't finish an episode and immediately want to watch another one. I don't find myself wanting to explore the characters further. I don't feel the urge to revisit old scenes or go searching for extra content. Instead, I'm perfectly happy to move on to something else. And considering how much time Sword Art Online expects you to invest, that's not exactly a great selling point. With Hearts to Hearts, though, the opposite happens. One video can lead to another, which leads to another song, which leads to a live performance, which leads to some random clip I found while browsing, and suddenly I've spent way more time watching Hearts to Hearts than I originally intended. That's the kind of entertainment I actually appreciate. It doesn't feel like homework. It feels like something I genuinely want to keep watching. And that's ultimately what entertainment is supposed to do. It should leave you wanting more. When something is genuinely enjoyable, you finish it and immediately think about what you want to watch next. You don't need somebody to tell you to continue. You don't need to convince yourself that the next episode will eventually become good. You just want more because you're having fun. That's why, when I compare these two, the difference couldn't be clearer. Hearts to Hearts makes me want to keep watching. Sword Art Online makes me want to stop watching. Hearts to Hearts makes me curious about what comes next. Sword Art Online makes me curious about how quickly the episode can end. So if I finish watching Hearts to Hearts and immediately go looking for more content, while I finish Sword Art Online and feel like I've just escaped a hostage situation, I think that tells you everything you need to know about which one I find more entertaining. Another thing that makes Hearts to Hearts more enjoyable for me is the chemistry between the members. I genuinely like watching them interact with each other because their personalities bounce off one another in a way that feels natural and entertaining. Whether they're joking around, reacting to each other, performing together, or just having casual conversations, there's a sense that you're watching a group of people who actually enjoy spending time together. That chemistry makes the members more interesting because you aren't just watching them individually. You're watching how they bring out different sides of each other. And that's something that can make a huge difference in how enjoyable a group is. You can have talented individual members, but if their interactions are boring, the overall experience isn't going to be nearly as fun. Hearts to Hearts has the advantage of letting you see these relationships develop naturally over time. The more content you watch, the more familiar you become with their personalities and the way they interact. You start recognizing their different dynamics, and that makes even simple interactions entertaining. Sword Art Online doesn't give me that same feeling. A huge part of the series depends on its characters having relationships that we're supposed to care about, especially the romantic relationships, but I rarely find them convincing. The story often tells me that two characters are incredibly important to each other, and I'm just sitting there wondering if I'm supposed to feel something that isn't actually there for me. Kirito and Asuna are probably the biggest example. We're constantly reminded that they're this incredibly important couple, and the series spends a lot of time presenting their relationship as this deep, meaningful connection. But personally, I don't find their chemistry particularly compelling. It often feels like the story decided they were supposed to be the perfect couple and then expected the audience to accept it as fact. And that's a problem because chemistry can't simply be declared by the writer. You can't just have two characters stand next to each other, exchange some dramatic dialogue, and then announce that they're soulmates. The audience actually has to believe the relationship. There needs to be interesting interaction, personality clashes, humor, vulnerability, and moments that make you understand why these two people actually enjoy being around each other. With Hearts to Hearts, I don't need anyone to tell me that the members have chemistry. I can see it. Their interactions are part of the entertainment. They can tease each other, laugh together, react to one another, and have completely different personalities while still feeling like they belong together as a group. That makes me want to watch more of their content because I'm interested in seeing those dynamics continue. And that's especially important because Hearts2Hearts isn't relying on some massive fictional plot to make those interactions interesting. They don't need a world-ending threat or some ridiculous dramatic situation to create an excuse for the members to interact. They can literally just be themselves, and that's enough to keep me entertained. Meanwhile, Sword Art Online can throw its characters into increasingly ridiculous situations and expect me to become emotionally invested because the stakes are supposedly enormous. But if I don't believe the relationships between the characters in the first place, making the situation more dramatic doesn't help. If anything, it makes the disconnect even more obvious. That's another reason I prefer Hearts2Hearts. Their chemistry makes me want to spend more time with the group. I enjoy seeing how the members interact, how their personalities complement each other, and how their relationships develop over time. With Sword Art Online, I don't get that feeling. The relationships are often presented as incredibly important, but I don't personally find them compelling enough to make me care. So once again, Hearts2Hearts wins. I would much rather watch 8 members joking around and interacting with each other than watch Sword Art Online spend another episode desperately trying to convince me that its characters have amazing chemistry. It's honestly really hard for me to choose a bias in Hearts2Hearts because every single member brings something different to the group. They all have their own personalities, charms, and strengths, which makes it difficult to pick just one favorite. Usually with groups, there's one member who immediately stands out to me, but with Hearts2Hearts, I found myself liking all of the members almost equally. That being said, if I absolutely had to choose one, I would probably go with Stella. There's just something about her that really catches my attention. Whether it's her visuals, her stage presence, her personality, or the way she carries herself, she has a certain charm that makes her easy to notice. Every time she appears, she brings a lot of energy and personality, and she quickly became the member I found myself paying the most attention to. Of course, that doesn't mean I don't enjoy the other members. One of the things I like about Hearts2Hearts is that the group feels very balanced. Every member has something unique to offer, and it's easy to appreciate different things about each of them. But if I had to pick the one member who stands out the most to me personally, Stella would probably be my choice. While it's difficult for me to pick a favorite member in Hearts2Hearts, it's honestly not difficult at all for me to pick a favorite character in Sword Art Online. The reason is simple. I don't have one. With Hearts2Hearts, every member has something that makes them interesting. I can see the appeal of each member, and choosing just one feels unfair because they all bring something different to the group. There's a reason it's hard to decide on a bias when every member is enjoyable to watch. Sword Art Online is the complete opposite for me. I don't have a favorite character because I don't really like any of them. None of the characters stand out to me in a positive way, and I never found myself getting attached to their personalities, relationships, or storylines. Instead of having multiple characters that make me think, I can't choose between them. I have the opposite reaction where I'm just not interested in any of them. That's one of the biggest differences between Hearts2Hearts and Sword Art Online. Hearts2Hearts makes me want to learn more about the members, watch their performances, and see their interactions. Sword Art Online never gave me that same feeling. I wasn't excited to see what the characters would do next because I never felt invested in them to begin with. Additionally, let's take a look at some other K-pop groups you should definitely check out. If you enjoyed Hearts2Hearts or you're just looking for more groups to add to your playlist, there are plenty of great options worth exploring. I'll go through some of my personal recommendations and highlight the groups, songs, and music videos that I think are worth your time. There are so many different styles and concepts across K-pop that there's a good chance you'll find something you really enjoy. And unlike Sword Art Online, you don't have to sit through an entire series hoping it eventually becomes interesting. You can just pick a group, put on a music video, and immediately see what they have to offer. K-pop thrives on experimentation. Every few years, a group comes along that doesn't just follow whatever is popular at the moment, but actually tries to push the boundaries of what a pop song is supposed to sound like. Sometimes that experimentation becomes a massive success. Sometimes it completely divides listeners. And very few groups have managed to create that kind of debate quite like NMIXX. Since their debut, And Mix has built a large part of their identity around one of the most controversial concepts in modern K-pop, mix pop. It's a style built around sudden genre switches, sharp transitions, dramatic changes in mood, and songs that seemingly refuse to stay in one lane for more than a few seconds. Some people hear that and immediately think it's innovative. They love the unpredictability and the fact that N-Mix doesn't sound like everyone else. Other listeners hear the exact same song and think it sounds messy, disjointed, or like several completely different songs were accidentally glued together. And honestly, that division is exactly what makes mix pop so interesting. So, what actually is mix pop, and why does it trigger such strong reactions? Why can one listener hear a bold and creative experiment while another hears a musical car crash? And more importantly, was N-Mix actually successful in making this strange concept work? At its core, mix pop is actually a pretty simple idea. Instead of sticking to one genre or smoothly blending several genres together, a song combines multiple completely different styles into one track, often switching between them abruptly. You might get one sound that feels like a conventional pop song, only for the track to suddenly transform into something completely different. Instead of gradually developing one musical idea, the song can effectively throw that idea away and introduce another one. That goes directly against how most mainstream pop music is structured. Usually, even when a song changes between verses, pre-choruses, choruses, bridges, and other sections, there's still some kind of central identity holding everything together. The listener knows they're still listening to the same song. The instrumentation might change, the energy might increase, and the melody might evolve, but there is usually some underlying consistency that keeps the entire thing connected. Mix pop rejects a lot of that stability. A section doesn't necessarily develop naturally into the next one. Instead, it can feel like one musical idea gets replaced by another. The song doesn't always guide the listener through a smooth progression. Sometimes it interrupts that progression completely and starts over with an entirely different sound. And the transitions aren't subtle either. That's an important part of the concept. Mix pop isn't trying to hide the fact that the song is changing. The contrast is supposed to be obvious. The idea is to put multiple sounds, genres, moods, and musical identities into one track and let them collide. It's supposed to be unpredictable, but that's also where the problem starts. Because there's a huge difference between a song feeling unpredictable and a song feeling disconnected. If the transitions are executed well, they can create a genuine wait, what just happened? Moment that makes you want to keep listening. But if the different sections don't feel like they belong together, the exact same transition can come across as a completely random interruption. And that's why mix pop creates such divided reactions. One person hears an exciting change of direction. Another person hears a song that just restarted halfway through. Some people absolutely love it. And it's easy to understand why. K-pop is an incredibly competitive genre, and there are countless groups releasing music every year. A lot of songs follow familiar structures, because those structures work. You get your verse, your build-up, your chorus, your repetition, and eventually your ending. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it does mean that something genuinely unusual can stand out very quickly. Mix pop certainly does that. When you're listening to an N-Mix song, you can't always predict where it's going next. Just when you think you've figured out the direction of the song, it can suddenly change again. That unpredictability becomes part of the listening experience. Instead of simply waiting for the chorus to return, you're actively paying attention because you want to know what N-Mix is going to throw at you next. And for fans of the concept, that's exactly the appeal. Every section can feel like a new reveal. You aren't just listening passively in the background. You're constantly processing what's happening. The song keeps changing the rules on you, and for some listeners, that makes it far more exciting than a conventional pop song. It's almost like musical whiplash, except the people who enjoy it are actually asking for more. But there is an equally strong argument on the other side. For some listeners, mix pop doesn't feel innovative. It feels disjointed. Instead of sounding like one complete composition, the song can sound like several different ideas competing for attention. One section might be genuinely great, but before you've had enough time to appreciate it, the song has already moved somewhere else. And that can create a very specific problem. None of the individual ideas get enough time to fully develop. Just as one section starts to settle in, another one appears. There's less time to build familiarity with a melody, less opportunity for repetition, and sometimes less of a sense that the song is actually going somewhere. Instead of building momentum toward a satisfying payoff, the constant switching can feel like the song keeps hitting the reset button. For people who prefer traditional pop structures, that can be incredibly frustrating. And this is where expectations become extremely important. Most listeners have been trained by years of pop music to expect certain things. We expect repetition because repetition makes songs memorable. We expect build-up because build-up makes the payoff feel satisfying. We expect a chorus to return because hearing something familiar gives the song an anchor. Mix pop messes with those expectations. Instead of telling you, here's the hook, you're going to hear this several times, and by the end you'll have it stuck in your head, it can effectively say, here's one idea. Enjoy it, because we're about to do something completely different. The best way to see this is by looking at NMIX's early releases, particularly songs like Surprised Face and Dice. Both tracks demonstrate exactly why mix pop became such a controversial concept. They establish a recognizable sound and atmosphere, but then they dramatically shift direction just as the listener begins to understand where the song is going. For someone who enjoys that kind of unpredictability, it's exciting. For someone who wants a song to establish a groove and stick with it, it's exhausting. And that leads into a much bigger question. Does a pop song actually need to be cohesive to work? Because that's really the debate underneath all of this. When people criticize mix pop, they're not necessarily saying that experimentation itself is bad. They're often saying that experimentation needs to serve the song. A strange transition can be incredibly effective if it feels intentional and satisfying. But if the listener feels like they're being pulled out of one song and dropped into another, then the experimentation can become a distraction rather than an enhancement. On the other hand, fans of mix pop would argue that this expectation of cohesion is exactly what the concept is challenging. Why does every song need to flow in a predictable way? Why can't a track deliberately sound fragmented? Why can't the contrast itself be the artistic point? And honestly, that's a pretty interesting argument. Because if every pop song followed exactly the same rules, music would become incredibly predictable. Part of the reason experimentation exists is because somebody eventually decides that the established formula isn't enough. Someone has to be willing to make something strange enough that people initially don't know what to make of it. That's essentially what NMIX did with mix pop. The problem is that being different doesn't automatically mean being good. And that's where the discussion becomes more complicated. A song can be unique and still not work. It can be ambitious and still be unpleasant to listen to. It can challenge conventions and still leave people wondering why they were challenged in the first place. Innovation is valuable, but innovation by itself isn't a substitute for execution. This is also where casual listeners become important. Most people aren't sitting down with a music production textbook and analyzing the structure of a song. They're simply listening to it. They want something that sounds good. They want a melody they can remember. They want a chorus that makes them want to listen again. And if a song doesn't connect with them quickly, they're probably going to move on. That's especially true in the streaming era. People have more music available to them than ever before. If a song doesn't immediately grab someone's attention, there are thousands of alternatives waiting behind it. You don't necessarily get 10 chances to convince someone that your song is secretly brilliant. Mix pop can be difficult in that environment because it often asks the listener to adapt. The first listen might be confusing. You might not know what you're supposed to focus on. You might enjoy one section but dislike another. You might finish the song and not even know whether you liked it. And that's a problem if you're trying to win over casual listeners. Repetition is one of the most powerful tools in pop music because familiarity creates attachment. The more you hear a melody, the more recognizable it becomes. Eventually, something that initially sounded ordinary can become incredibly addictive simply because you've heard it enough times. Mix pop can make that process more difficult because it constantly resets the listener's expectations. But here's where the defenders of the concept have a very good point. Sometimes the first listen isn't the final verdict. A song that sounds chaotic at first can become much more enjoyable after repeated listens. Once you know where the transitions are coming, they can stop feeling like interruptions. You begin to understand how the different sections fit together. A moment that originally sounded strange can suddenly become the part you're waiting for. That's one of the most interesting things about mix pop. The listener's relationship with the song can actually change over time. The first listen might be, "What am I listening to?" The second might be, "Okay, I think I understand what they're doing." And eventually it can become, "Wait, why is this part actually stuck in my head?" That's a very different kind of musical experience from a song that immediately gives you everything on the first listen. From that perspective, mix pop isn't necessarily designed for instant gratification. It's designed to reward people who are willing to spend more time with it. Instead of being something you completely understand within 30 seconds, it can become something you gradually figure out. And for fans, that process is part of the fun. You start noticing patterns you missed before. You become familiar with the transitions. You know when the song is about to switch, and instead of being surprised by it, you start looking forward to it. The thing that originally made the song difficult to understand eventually becomes one of the reasons you enjoy it. But that also explains why mix pop is never going to be universally loved. It asks something from the listener. You have to be willing to accept the unpredictability. You have to be willing to listen. More than once. You have to be willing to let go of some of the expectations you normally bring to pop music. And not everyone wants to do that. Some people just want a song they can put on immediately and enjoy. There's nothing wrong with that. Music doesn't need to be homework. Nobody should have to study a song before they're allowed to decide whether they like it. At the same time, there's nothing wrong with wanting music that challenges you either. That's ultimately what makes mix pop such an interesting experiment. It isn't simply trying to make songs more complicated for the sake of being complicated. It's challenging the assumption that pop music needs to follow one predictable path. And whether you think that works or not, you have to admit that mix made people pay attention. That brings us to another important part of the concept, the reaction itself. Mix pop was never likely to be universally accepted. The entire idea is inherently polarizing. If you create music that deliberately breaks expectations, you're almost guaranteed to get people who love it and people who absolutely hate it. And in a crowded industry like K-pop, getting a strong reaction can be valuable. As Lily has expressed, having mixed opinions about something can be better than having no opinion at all. Because the worst possible outcome for an artist isn't necessarily criticism. Sometimes it's being completely ignored. And mix certainly wasn't ignored. People talked about mix pop. They argued about it. They debated whether the songs were innovative or chaotic. They praised the group's willingness to experiment. They criticized the lack of cohesion. They made reaction videos. They discussed individual sections. They compared the songs to other styles of pop production. Whether you loved mix pop or hated it, you knew what mix was trying to do. And that is a form of identity. In an industry where standing out can be incredibly difficult, having something that immediately separates you from everyone else is valuable. You could hear a song and think, "This sounds strange," but at least you weren't thinking, "This could have been released by literally anyone." That's the biggest strength of mix pop. It gave mix a recognizable identity from the beginning. But was the mix pop experiment actually successful? That depends entirely on how you define success. If success means immediate mainstream appeal, effortless first listen enjoyment, and a sound that everyone can easily get behind, then the results are obviously mixed. The concept has always been divisive, and some listeners simply aren't going to enjoy that kind of songwriting no matter how many times they hear it. But if success means standing out, challenging expectations, creating conversation, and giving a group a distinctive identity, then mix pop absolutely accomplished something. Mix didn't enter the K-pop industry sounding like every other group. They deliberately chose an approach that could have easily backfired, and they committed to it strongly enough that people immediately understood what made them different. That's not nothing. At the same time, I don't think we should automatically praise something simply because it's experimental. It's different isn't the end of the discussion. The real question is whether the experimentation actually improves the music. And that's where individual listeners are going to come to completely different conclusions. One person can hear a brilliant transition and think, "This is exactly why I love mix." Another person can hear the exact same transition and think, "Please pick one song and finish it." Neither reaction is particularly surprising, because ultimately, mix pop isn't designed to make everyone happy. It's designed to make you pay attention. And whether you consider that a strength or a weakness depends on what you want from pop music in the first place. If you want consistency, repetition, smooth transitions, and immediate accessibility, mix pop might drive you insane. But if you want unpredictability, experimentation, and songs that refuse to behave like conventional pop music, then mix pop can be incredibly refreshing. That's what makes the concept so difficult to label. It's not a simple success story, because there are legitimate criticisms of the approach. But it's also not a failure, because NMIX accomplished exactly what experimentation is supposed to accomplish. They created something people couldn't easily ignore. And maybe that's the most interesting thing about mix pop. It doesn't really matter whether everyone agrees that it works. The fact that we're still talking about it means it made an impression. In a genre where songs can disappear from the public conversation almost as quickly as they're released, and mix chose to make music that demands a reaction. You might love it. You might hate it. You might need 5 listens before you decide how you feel about it. But you're probably going to have an opinion. And honestly, that's a pretty interesting place for an artist to be. So, was mix pop a successful experiment? I don't think there's one definitive answer. If you're judging it by instant accessibility and universal appeal, the answer is complicated. But if you're judging it by originality, identity, experimentation, and the ability to make people stop and pay attention, then NMIX clearly achieved something. Mix pop may not be for everyone, and honestly, it was probably never supposed to be. It's strange. It's unpredictable. It's divisive. Sometimes it works brilliantly, and sometimes it can feel like the musical equivalent of someone changing the channel halfway through a song. But that's also what makes NMIX interesting. They were willing to take a formula people were comfortable with and deliberately mess with it. And whether you think they created something brilliant or something completely chaotic, you can't really accuse them of being boring. And in K-pop, where standing out is becoming harder and harder, maybe that's the biggest success of all. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more K-pop analysis, deep dives, and discussions about the groups and songs that keep the K-pop world interesting. In 2016, a group was created with an expiration date built into its very existence. IY came together through Produce 101, a survival show where 101 trainees competed for a limited number of spots, knowing that every elimination could end their dream before it even began. Out of all those contestants, only 11 made it to the end. They debuted as IY, quickly became one of the biggest girl groups of their generation, and then, almost unbelievably, disappeared less than a year later. They rose, exploded in popularity, reached the height of their momentum, and were gone almost as quickly as they arrived. And that's what makes IY such a fascinating group to look back on. Their story wasn't cut short because they failed. They weren't struggling to find an audience. They weren't slowly fading into irrelevance. If anything, they were still building momentum when the clock ran out. Their temporary status was always part of the deal, but that doesn't make the ending any less frustrating. Imagine watching a group become increasingly popular and then being told, right when they're starting to hit their stride, that this is where the story ends. Now, years later, most of the members are set to return for a reunion anniversary, giving fans another brief opportunity to see the members together again. And while a reunion like that is exciting, it also brings back a question that has never completely gone away. What if IY had never disbanded? What if those 11 members had been allowed to continue beyond that incredibly short window of time? What if they had gone into a second year together, then a third, and eventually developed into a permanent group with an entire career ahead of them? Instead of splitting apart just as their popularity was taking off, what if they had been able to turn that early success into something much bigger? Because when you look at IY's history now, the timeline almost feels ridiculous. A group with that much attention, that much potential, and that much influence existed for such a short amount of time. They barely had the opportunity to establish what their long-term identity could have been before they were forced to go their separate ways. And that's where this alternate timeline gets interesting. If IY had stayed together beyond that first year, the biggest immediate difference would have been momentum. In reality, they reached the end of their contract just as their popularity was continuing to grow. The members were then pulled back toward their respective agencies, where completely different plans were waiting for them. Some would eventually debut again in new groups, while others would pursue different career paths. But in this alternate timeline, that separation never happens. Instead, the 11 members move directly into a second year as IY. They aren't starting from scratch anymore. They've already survived one of the biggest survival shows in K-pop, debuted successfully, built a recognizable identity, and proven that audiences wanted to see them together. Their fan base has had time to grow, and now the group has something incredibly valuable that most rookie groups spend years trying to build: momentum. Their first comeback in this timeline would therefore feel completely different from their debut. It wouldn't be about introducing IY to the public anymore. Everyone already knows who they are. Now they would have something to prove. Their second-year comeback would be the moment where they demonstrate that IY isn't just a temporary project that happened to become popular. They're a legitimate long-term group with the potential to remain at the top of the industry. And that could lead to a noticeable evolution in their concept. Their early image was bright, youthful, energetic, and immediately accessible, which made sense for a newly formed project group. But after another year together, they would have the opportunity to mature. Instead of simply repeating what worked during their debut period, they could begin experimenting with a more confident and sophisticated sound. The members would have more experience as performers, and the group could start exploring concepts that would have been difficult to pull off during their first few months. That evolution would be important because one of the biggest challenges facing any long-running K-pop group is avoiding stagnation. If IY simply released the same type of song over and over again, eventually the novelty would wear off. But if they gradually evolved while maintaining the identity that made people love them in the first place, they could potentially turn their initial popularity into something much more sustainable. And this is where the group's unusual structure would become both its biggest advantage and its biggest problem. IY wasn't created by one company. The 11 members came from different agencies, each with their own plans, priorities, and ambitions for their artists. In the real timeline, that was one of the reasons their temporary structure existed in the first place. Their agencies ultimately wanted their trainees and idols back. But imagine those companies agreeing to keep the group together permanently. That would create an entirely different situation. You would have 11 members, multiple agencies, competing business interests, different ideas about how the group should be promoted, and different expectations for each member's individual career. Some members would inevitably become more popular than others. Certain members might receive more lines, more center time, more endorsements, or more attention from the public. Some agencies would probably want to push their members toward individual opportunities, while others might be more interested in keeping the group active. Those conflicts wouldn't magically disappear just because IY became permanent. If anything, they would become more important. But there would also be a major difference compared with the real timeline. Everyone would know that the group itself was still the priority. Instead of constantly preparing for the inevitable moment when the members would return to their agencies, the companies would have an incentive to make IY work as a long-term investment. And if the group continued succeeding, that incentive would only become stronger. Musically, a second-year IY could also become much more ambitious. They would no longer be treated purely as rookies. Their success would give producers and agencies more freedom to experiment with them because there would already be an established audience waiting for their next release. You could potentially see them move through several different concepts over the years. They could maintain their brighter sound for certain releases while gradually introducing darker, more mature, more experimental, or more sophisticated concepts. Individual members could also develop more distinctive roles within the group as their strengths became clearer. The important thing is that the group would finally have time to develop an identity naturally. Instead of trying to establish who IY was in the space of a few months, they could spend several years figuring it out. And that extra time could completely change how the public perceived them. In reality, IY always had an unusual sense of urgency surrounding them because everyone knew they were temporary. Every comeback mattered because there were only so many opportunities left. Every promotion felt like part of a countdown. But remove that countdown, and the psychology completely changes. Fans aren't wondering how much time they have left. They're wondering what the group will do next. That's a massive difference. Instead of watching IOI while knowing that the group will eventually disappear, fans could start thinking long-term. They could imagine the members growing together, changing concepts, releasing albums, going on tours, winning awards, and eventually becoming one of those groups whose careers span an entire generation. And that would also change the way every comeback is received. The public wouldn't just be asking, "What is IOI doing this time?" They would be asking, "Where is IOI going next?" That distinction matters because long-term groups are able to build a legacy gradually. They aren't defined by one successful song or one successful era. They have years of releases that allow fans to look back and see how the group evolved. IOI never got that opportunity. They had the beginning. They had the popularity. They had the fan base. They had the momentum. What they didn't have was time. And in this alternate timeline, that's the one thing they finally get. By the end of their second year, IOI would no longer simply be remembered as the successful group that came from Produce 101. They would have another full year of promotions behind them, another collection of songs, another series of performances, and another year of growing their fan base. At that point, the conversation would start changing. People wouldn't be asking whether IOI was a successful project group anymore. They'd be asking whether IOI was becoming one of the defining girl groups of their generation. And that's where the alternate timeline gets really interesting because once you give IOI another year, you have to start asking what happens after that. Does their popularity continue growing? Do they become one of the biggest girl groups in K-pop? Do the individual members still eventually pursue their own groups and careers? What happens to the groups that were eventually created using former IOI members? And perhaps most importantly, how different would the entire K-pop landscape look if IOI had been allowed to become the permanent group they had the potential to be? Because the first year of IOI proved that the group could become successful. The years that never happened are where the real what if begins. Most K-pop fans know the story of LE SSERAFIM's debut. The group originally debuted with 6 members, only for Kim Garam to be removed from the lineup shortly afterward. But what many people don't realize is that the final lineup wasn't always supposed to look the way it did. Long before LE SSERAFIM officially debuted, Source Music was evaluating trainees, changing plans, and trying to determine which members would ultimately become part of the group. Some trainees came surprisingly close to debuting, only to disappear before the public ever knew they were being considered. One of those trainees was Ruka. And before anyone gets confused, no, I'm not talking about Ruka from Baby Monster. This is a completely different Ruka, and her story is one of those behind-the-scenes K-pop stories that could have turned out completely differently with just one change in circumstances. Ruka was born Shimazaki Haruka on February 10, 2005, in Shizuoka Prefecture, Japan. What makes her story even more remarkable is how young she was when she decided to pursue her dream of becoming a K-pop idol. At just 14 years old, Ruka moved from Japan to South Korea on her own, leaving behind her home and stepping into an entirely unfamiliar environment because she wanted to become an idol. That alone gives you an idea of how serious she was about this dream. Most teenagers are worrying about school, friends, and what they're going to do over the weekend. Ruka was moving to another country and beginning years of intensive trainee life. And this was only the beginning. In 2019, Ruka joined Cube Entertainment and began training there. She spent roughly 2 years as a trainee, developing her dancing, performance skills, and overall abilities before eventually leaving the company in 2021. But instead of giving up on becoming an idol, Ruka simply started over somewhere else. After leaving Cube Entertainment, she joined Source Music. And this is where her story becomes particularly interesting because Ruka ended up training alongside several people who would eventually become members of LE SSERAFIM. Among them were Sakura, Chaiwon, and Yeonjun. They were all going through the same exhausting trainee process together, practicing for hours, being evaluated, improving their skills, and hoping that they would eventually make it to debut. Imagine spending that much time with people who are working toward exactly the same dream as you. Naturally, friendships and bonds can develop. These weren't just random trainees who happened to work in the same building. They were people experiencing the same pressure and uncertainty together. And for Ruka, there was a very real possibility that she could eventually debut alongside them. But then the final lineup began to take shape. And Ruka wasn't in it. This is one of the harshest realities of the K-pop trainee system. You can spend years training. You can work harder than almost anyone around you. You can become close friends with people who eventually debut. You can even get incredibly close to the final lineup yourself. And none of that guarantees anything. Until the final decision is made, you're still a trainee. One evaluation can change everything. A concept can change. The company can change its plans. Another trainee can be brought in. A member can suddenly fit the company's vision better. And just like that, someone who thought they were getting closer to their dream can find themselves outside the lineup. That's essentially what happened to Ruka. She was ultimately cut from the group, and her departure was understandably difficult. Not only was she losing the opportunity she'd been working toward, but she was also leaving behind trainees she had spent a significant amount of time with. The people she had trained alongside were now moving forward without her. And there's something especially heartbreaking about that. Imagine spending years preparing for the same dream as your friends, only to watch them debut while you have to go back to the drawing board. For Ruka, that's exactly what happened. What's interesting is that most fans probably would have never known about her at all if it weren't for Le Seraphim's documentary content. The documentary gave viewers a rare look at the group's pre-debut preparation and showed that there were people involved in the process who ultimately didn't make the final lineup. Without that footage, Ruka could have simply disappeared into the enormous pool of former K-pop trainees whose stories are never publicly known. And that's what makes her appearance in the documentary so interesting. We know what happened to Kim Garam after debut, but Garam was reportedly edited out of later content following her removal from the group. Ruka, meanwhile, remained visible in the documentary despite never becoming an official member. That means fans were given a glimpse of someone who came incredibly close to debuting but ultimately didn't make it. It's one of those rare situations where you get to see the person who almost became part of K-pop history. As for exactly why Ruka was cut, there doesn't appear to be an official explanation that definitively confirms one specific reason. There are many variables that can influence a company's final decision, so it's important not to present speculation as fact. One commonly suggested possibility is that Ruka ultimately didn't fit the exact concept or image Source Music wanted for the final group. That's something that can happen extremely late in the trainee process. A company might completely change its vision for a group, adjust the concept, decide that the lineup needs a different balance, or simply determine that another trainee fits the planned image better. And in this case, the spot eventually went to Kazuha. That's another brutal part of the story. Ruka wasn't necessarily replaced because she was untalented. The final lineup simply went in a different direction. And for someone who had already spent years training and had gotten this close, that has to be an incredibly difficult thing to accept. But Ruka didn't give up. After failing to debut with Le Seraphim, she left Source Music and eventually joined Belift Lab. And once again, she found herself in a familiar position, training, preparing, and hoping that this would finally be the opportunity that allowed her to debut. Then came Are You Next?, the survival show created to determine the members of what would eventually become ILIT. For Ruka, this was another opportunity to prove herself. She wasn't just an unknown trainee anymore. She had already spent years training at multiple companies, had come extremely close to debuting with Le Seraphim, and now had another chance to compete for a spot in a final lineup. Throughout the competition, she continued demonstrating her skills and determination. But once again, the story didn't go the way she wanted. In episode 6, Ruka was eliminated. She ultimately ranked 17th overall, meaning she once again missed out on the opportunity to debut. And this is where Ruka's story becomes genuinely difficult to look at. She had already spent years training. She had moved between companies. She had come close to debuting with one major group. Then she entered another company and competed in another survival show, only to be eliminated again. For some people, that might have been enough to make them give up completely. But Ruka continued. She eventually left Belift Lab in 2024, but that still wasn't the end of her journey. Then, on February 10th, 2026, which happened to be her 21st birthday, Ruka announced another major development. She had signed an exclusive contract with Twin Planet Entertainment, a Japanese agency. And that completely changes the feeling of where her story is right now. Because after everything she's been through, Ruka isn't simply someone who failed to debut and disappeared. She's still actively pursuing a career in entertainment. She's still here. And she's still trying. At this point, it's impossible to know exactly what comes next. Maybe she'll eventually debut in a new group. Maybe she'll pursue solo activities. Maybe she'll focus on dancing, modeling, acting, or something completely different. There's no guarantee that her next chapter will look anything like the one she originally imagined. But that's also what makes her story worth following. Her journey isn't finished. And she's remained surprisingly active online as well. Ruka regularly shares content across platforms such as YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, giving fans a chance to see what she's been doing outside of the trainee system. That content also gives people a much more personal look at her. Instead of only seeing her as the trainee who almost debuted with Le Seraphim or the contestant who was eliminated from Are You Next, fans can actually see her personality, interests, daily life, and continued passion for performing. One particularly interesting moment came when Kim Garam eventually opened her Instagram account. Ruka liked the very first photo Garam posted. It's a tiny interaction, but considering their connection through the Le Seraphim trainee period, it's the kind of detail that fans naturally notice. It's also a reminder that these trainees aren't just names on a lineup sheet. They formed friendships. They shared experiences. They spent years working toward the same dream. And even when their careers eventually went in completely different directions, some of those connections can remain. Ruka also frequently posts dance covers of K-pop songs, which is another indication that her passion for performing clearly hasn't disappeared. Even without being part of an official idol group, she's continued dancing and creating content around the things she originally dreamed of doing. And honestly, that's probably one of the most encouraging parts of this entire story. Ruka has had multiple opportunities to walk away. She didn't make the Le Seraphim lineup. She didn't make the I-Lit lineup. She left multiple companies. She experienced rejection over and over again. And yet she keeps finding another path forward. That's something people don't always see when they look at K-pop idols. Fans see the finished product, the debut, the music videos, the performances, the stage outfits, the awards, and the success. What they don't see are the hundreds of trainees who never make it, the people who train for years and disappear, the people who make it to the final evaluation and get cut, the people who debut in another group years later, and the people who keep trying even after being rejected multiple times. Ruka's story is a glimpse into that hidden side of the industry. It's also a reminder that debuting isn't necessarily the end goal of a trainee's story. Sometimes it's simply one possible outcome. Ruka has already had multiple chances taken away from her, but she's still building a career and still pursuing opportunities in entertainment. And perhaps that's why I don't think Ruka's story should be viewed as a story about failure. Yes, she failed to debut with Le Seraphim. Yes, she failed to make the final lineup on Are You Next? But those aren't the only chapters of her career. She trained at major companies. She worked alongside future idols who would go on to become extremely successful. She appeared in pre-debut documentary footage connected to one of K-pop's biggest girl groups. She competed on a major survival show. She continued performing. And now she has signed with a Japanese entertainment agency. That's not the end of a story. That's a career that is still developing. And honestly, after everything Ruka has already been through, I'm curious to see where she goes from here. Because her story could have ended several times already. It could have ended when she left Cube. It could have ended when she was cut from the Le Seraphim lineup. It could have ended when she was eliminated from Are You Next? It could have ended when she left Belift Lab. But it didn't. She kept going. And now, at 21 years old, Ruka has another opportunity to build something for herself. Maybe this will finally be the chapter where everything comes together. Or maybe she'll take her career in a direction nobody expects. Either way, her story is still being written. And that's what makes Ruka someone worth keeping an eye on. She came incredibly close to becoming a member of Le Seraphim, came close to debuting again through I-Lit Survival Show, and now has another opportunity waiting for her in Japan. After years of rejection, uncertainty, and starting over, perhaps the most interesting part of Ruka's story isn't the fact that she didn't debut. It's the fact that she never stopped trying. And that might make whatever happens next even more interesting. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe for more K-pop deep dives, untold trainee stories, and behind-the-scenes stories about the groups and idols you may not know about. What if I told you that one decision could have changed the entire future of K-pop? Back in 2012, SM Entertainment wasn't simply debuting another boy group. They were attempting something incredibly ambitious, and at the time, there was nothing quite like it. EXO wasn't designed to dominate just one country. The plan was to build a group capable of operating across two of Asia's biggest music markets simultaneously. 12 members, 2 units. One group split between Korea and China. EXO-K would promote in South Korea, while EXO-M would promote in China. They would share the same overall identity, release music at the same time, and essentially function as two sides of the same group. If it worked, this wasn't supposed to be just another successful SM entertainment group. It could have become a blueprint for how K-pop expanded internationally. And for a while, it actually looked like the experiment was working. Then everything started falling apart. One member left. Then another. Then another. Suddenly there were lawsuits, controversy, uncertainty, and a group that was no longer operating the way it had originally been designed to operate. The 12-member structure began disappearing piece by piece, and with it went the original vision behind EXO. But here's the question that makes this story so fascinating. What if none of that happened? What if Chris Wu stayed? What if Luhan stayed? What if Tao stayed? What if EXO remained 12 members and the original EXO-K and EXO-M system continued operating for years? Because if that had happened, we wouldn't simply be talking about a different version of EXO. There's a very real possibility that the entire K-pop industry could have developed differently. To understand why, you first have to understand just how unusual EXO's original concept actually was. This wasn't simply a 12-member group with a lot of people on stage. SM Entertainment deliberately divided the group into 2 units. EXO-K would primarily promote in Korea, while EXO-M would primarily promote in China. They could perform the same songs in different languages, target different markets, and promote simultaneously. It was essentially an attempt to create a multinational K-pop group before the industry had really figured out how to operate on that scale. And at the time, that was a massive gamble. China was already an enormous potential market, but expanding there wasn't as simple as translating a song and putting up a few advertisements. The entertainment industries were different, the regulations were different, the promotional environment was different, and the long-term relationship between Korean entertainment companies and the Chinese market was still developing. EXO was supposed to help bridge that gap. If the system succeeded, SM wouldn't just have another hit group. They would have proof that a K-pop group could be designed from the beginning to operate across multiple countries without abandoning its core identity. And early on, the results were extremely promising. By 2013, EXO's popularity exploded. Growl became a massive hit, their album sales skyrocketed, and their fanbase expanded rapidly throughout Korea, China, and other international markets. For a brief period, EXO didn't feel like an experiment anymore. They felt like the future. The dual-unit concept was actually working. EXO-K had a strong presence in Korea, EXO-M had a strong presence in China, and the 12 members gave the group an enormous amount of potential. Then 2014 happened. Chris Wu filed a lawsuit against SM Entertainment and left EXO. Suddenly, one of the members of EXO-M was gone. At first, fans were left trying to figure out exactly what was happening. Then, before the situation could even settle down, another member departed. Luhan left EXO later that year. And then, not long after that, Tao followed. 3 members of EXO-M were gone. And that wasn't just 3 people missing from a group photo. It fundamentally damaged the structure. EXO had been built around. Think about what EXO was supposed to be. 2 units operating across 2 markets. EXO-K and EXO-M were supposed to complement each other. But after the departures, one of those units had lost most of its original members. The original concept became much harder to maintain. EXO eventually evolved into a more traditional single-group structure, with the remaining members promoting together rather than maintaining the original Korea-China split in the way SM had initially envisioned. And that's where the real, what if begins. Because EXO wasn't struggling when this happened. They weren't some unsuccessful rookie group that was barely holding together. They were becoming one of the biggest groups in K-pop. Their popularity was growing. Their sales were growing. Their fan base was growing. And they were doing all of this at exactly the moment when their original international strategy was beginning to prove itself. Imagine removing the departures from that timeline. Imagine EXO entering the second half of the 2010s with all 12 members still together. EXO-K and EXO-M continue operating side by side. The Korean unit continues strengthening its position in Korea, while the Chinese unit develops an even deeper connection with the Chinese market. Instead of abandoning the original system before it fully matured, SM gets several more years to refine it. That could have had enormous consequences. For starters, EXO might have established an even stronger and more consistent presence in China before later political and industry complications made Korean entertainment promotions there much more difficult. And timing is extremely important here. The earlier K-pop establishes itself in a major international market, the more opportunities there are for companies to learn how to operate there. If EXO had spent years building a stable Korea-China model, other companies could have looked at that system and thought, we can do this too. Suddenly multinational. Groups might have become much more common. Companies could have started designing groups specifically around multiple markets instead of treating international expansion as something that happens after a group becomes successful in Korea. The globalization of K-pop could have accelerated. And that doesn't just affect China. It potentially changes the entire mindset of the industry. Instead of asking how Korean groups can enter foreign markets, companies might have started asking how they could build groups that were international from day one. And then we get to one of the biggest questions. What happens to EXO's competition? Because while EXO was becoming a powerhouse, another group was slowly building towards something unprecedented. BTS. By the late 2010s, BTS was becoming a global phenomenon, particularly in Western markets. Now, it's tempting to turn this hypothetical into a simple argument that says, if EXO stayed 12, EXO would have become bigger than BTS. But that's way too simplistic. BTS's rise was driven by a very specific combination of music, timing, fan engagement, social media, digital strategy, touring, and international audience development. There's no guarantee that EXO maintaining 12 members would have prevented BTS from becoming the global powerhouse they eventually became. But what could have changed is the competitive landscape. At their peak, EXO already had enormous album sales, a massive fan base, major brand recognition, and an established position across Asia. Now imagine adding a fully functioning China unit to that. Not one that collapses after only a few years. Not one that loses 3 of its members. A stable unit that continues expanding for years. That could have given EXO an even broader foundation to build from. They might have had more opportunities for international promotions, more cross-market exposure, and more experience operating as a genuinely multinational act before K-pop's global explosion reached its next stage. And that could have made the race at the top of K-pop much more interesting. Instead of the global expansion of K-pop being associated so heavily with one dominant group during the late 2010s, you could have had multiple major groups competing to define what the global K-pop era looked like. EXO could have been one of them. BTS could have been another. And the competition between them might have pushed the entire industry forward faster. More international tours. More overseas promotions. More collaborations. More investment in foreign language releases. More aggressive attempts to build fandoms outside Korea. The industry responds to competition. If 2 massive groups are fighting for global attention, everyone else has to adapt. That could have created a very different environment for the groups that came afterward. And it could have changed the way international audiences discovered K-pop. Instead of entering the genre through one dominant global act, fans might have encountered a much more competitive ecosystem where several groups were already fighting for their attention. That changes media coverage. It changes industry investment. It changes what companies believe is possible. And it changes the expectations placed on the next generation of idols. But there's another fascinating part of this hypothetical that can't be ignored. Chris Wu, Luhan, and Tao all went on to establish major careers in China after leaving EXO. Their departures didn't simply remove 3 members from EXO. They created 3 additional centers of influence. Each member developed their own career outside the group, which means that the decision to leave ultimately produced a completely different distribution of star power. If they had stayed, EXO might have been much more powerful as a 12-member group. But at the same time, their individual careers might never have developed in exactly the same way. That's what makes this hypothetical so difficult to answer. Would 12-member EXO have been bigger? Almost certainly in some ways. Would Chris, Luhan, and Tao have achieved the exact same level of individual success? That's impossible to know. Would EXO's Chinese presence have become more powerful? Potentially. Would the entire K-pop industry have changed? That's where things get really interesting. Because EXO wasn't simply a group. They were a test. SM Entertainment was testing whether a K-pop group could operate across borders as one unified system. And the original system didn't survive. But that doesn't necessarily mean the idea itself was wrong. In fact, what happened afterward suggests that SM learned from it. The company didn't abandon the idea of international expansion. Instead, it changed the way it approached it. Rather than trying to maintain one rigid group split across 2 markets, SM eventually developed the much larger NCT system, which was designed around multiple units and different regional markets. And that eventually included another major push into China through WayV. WayV is particularly important to the story because, in some ways, it represents a more flexible version of the kind of international strategy that EXO was attempting years earlier. WayV wasn't simply EXO-M 2.0. The structure, circumstances, and overall concept were different. But the underlying idea of creating a group with a strong connection to the Chinese market was still there. And unlike EXO-M, WayV was built within a much more flexible system. That flexibility matters. EXO's original structure was extremely ambitious, but it was also vulnerable. If enough key members left, the entire concept could be thrown off balance. NCT structure was designed with multiple units, allowing SM to distribute its members and regional strategies differently. And WayV demonstrates that the basic concept of building a K-pop act around a specific international market wasn't impossible. It just required a different structure. That's what makes EXO's original 12-member lineup so fascinating in retrospect. They were trying to do something the industry hadn't fully figured out yet. They were trying to prove that K-pop didn't have to be limited by national borders. And even though the original EXO-M experiment ultimately collapsed, the larger idea survived. It evolved. It changed shape. And eventually, other groups were able to build on lessons learned from those earlier attempts. So when we ask, what if EXO stayed 12? We're not just asking whether EXO would have had more members. We're asking what happens if one of K-pop's earliest major attempts at multinational expansion actually succeeds. What if EXO-K and EXO-M had remained fully operational? What if the Chinese market had become an even bigger part of EXO's identity? What if other companies had copied the model? What if K-pop's global expansion had accelerated several years earlier? What if the competition at the top of the industry had looked completely different? We can't know exactly what would have happened. Maybe EXO would have become an even bigger global powerhouse. Maybe BTS still would have risen exactly as they did. Maybe both groups would have dominated different parts of the global market simultaneously. Maybe other companies would have created entirely different kinds of multinational groups. Or maybe the original system would have encountered completely different problems even if all 12 members had stayed. That's the problem with alternate history. One decision creates another decision, which creates another, and eventually you're looking at an entirely different industry. But that's also what makes this particular what if so fascinating. Because EXO wasn't just successful. They were early. They were experimenting with a model that the K-pop industry would spend years trying to refine. And if that original 12-member experiment had actually worked, the blueprint for global K-pop might have been written very differently. Instead, EXO became something else. They remained one of the defining groups of their generation, but the original vision of 2 synchronized units operating across Korea and China largely disappeared. And perhaps the biggest irony is that the idea itself didn't disappear with it. SM simply learned how to build it differently. That's why Wavy matters. Wavy isn't proof that everything would have worked perfectly for EXO. But it is evidence that the underlying idea of building a K-pop group around international markets wasn't impossible. The industry just needed a better way to make the concept survive. And maybe that's the real legacy of EXO's original 12-member experiment. It didn't necessarily fail because the vision was impossible. It failed because the system wasn't prepared for everything that could go wrong. EXO was one of the first groups to seriously test what happens when K-pop stops thinking of itself as something confined to one country. And even though the experiment didn't end the way SM intended, the lessons from it helped shape what came afterward. So when you look back at those original 12 members, you're not just looking at an alternate version of EXO. You're looking at a completely different possible future for K-pop. A future where multinational groups became the norm earlier. A future where China played an even larger role in K-pop's expansion. A future where EXO and BTS potentially competed on a much more even international playing field. And a future where the global K-pop industry might have looked very different from the one we know today. We'll never know exactly what would have happened. But that's what makes the question so interesting. What if EXO stayed 12? Everyone knows ITZY as the bold, confident girl group that made an immediate impact when they debuted. From the beginning, they had a strong concept, powerful performances, and a lineup that felt incredibly well-suited to what JYP Entertainment wanted the group to become. But here's the thing, that lineup wasn't always guaranteed. Long before ITZY officially debuted, there was an entire group of JYP trainees working toward the same goal. They trained together, practiced together, went through evaluations together, and spent years wondering which of them would eventually make it to the stage. Some of these trainees were already familiar to the public. Others had built reputations inside JYP as some of the company's most promising young performers. And for some of them, it genuinely looked like debut was only a matter of time. Then the plans started changing. Trainees came and went. The company's plans evolved. The concept became more defined. Certain people who once seemed like obvious candidates gradually disappeared from the picture, while others found themselves being moved toward completely different opportunities. Some left JYP on their own. Others weren't selected for the final lineup. And some eventually debuted somewhere else entirely, sometimes years after they had originally been training alongside the future members of ITZY. That's what makes the pre-debut history of ITZY so fascinating. The group we know today wasn't necessarily the only version JYP could have created. Change just one or two decisions, and you could have ended up with a completely different lineup, a different distribution of roles, and potentially even a different group identity. So today we're going to take a look at some of the trainees who were connected to ITZY's pre-debut story, the people who came close to debuting alongside Yeji, Lia, Ryujin, Chaeryeong, and Yuna, and the completely different paths they eventually took. And by the end, you might start wondering just how different ITZY could have been if JYP had made even a few different choices. One of the biggest names associated with this story is Somi. And honestly, it's easy to understand why so many fans once assumed she would eventually debut in a JYP girl group. Long before ITZY existed, Somi had already become one of the most recognizable young trainees in K-pop. She first gained major attention through 16, the survival show that eventually created Twice. Even though she was one of the younger contestants, Somi immediately stood out. She had confidence, charisma, stage presence, and the kind of personality that made her easy for audiences to remember. Even though she didn't make the final Twice lineup, that wasn't the end of her story. If anything, it was just the beginning. Somi later competed on Produce 101, and this time she didn't just make the final lineup. She finished in first place. Out of 101 trainees, Somi became the #1 contestant. That was an enormous indication of just how much public recognition she had already built. She went on to debut as a member of IOI, giving her even more exposure and turning her into one of the most recognizable young idols associated with JYP Entertainment. And that's where the speculation about her eventually becoming part of JYP's next girl group really started making sense. If JYP was preparing another major girl group after Twice, why wouldn't one of its most recognizable young stars be part of it? For a while, It seemed entirely possible. But then everything changed. In August 2018, Somi officially left JYP Entertainment after years with the company. She subsequently signed with the Black label and began pursuing a solo career. Then in 2019, she debuted as a soloist. And just like that, one of the most obvious possible candidates for JYP's next girl group was no longer part of the equation. Now, there's an important distinction here. There isn't a simple official statement saying that Somi was definitely supposed to be an ITZY member and was removed at the last second. A lot of the discussion surrounding her connection to the group comes from her status as a prominent JYP trainee and the expectations fans had about the company's upcoming girl group. But it's not difficult to understand why the speculation became so widespread. Somi already had something most trainees could only dream of having: massive public recognition before even debuting with a permanent group. She had appeared on multiple survival shows, One Produce 101, debuted with IY, and developed a huge following. If she had joined ITZY, she probably would have entered the group with an enormous amount of attention already following her. And that could have created an interesting dynamic. ITZY's eventual identity was built around the members functioning as a strong collective. Yeji, Lia, Ryujin, Chaeryeong, and Yuna each brought something different to the group, and none of them entered the group with Somi's level of pre-existing mainstream recognition. If Somi had been added, there would have been an obvious possibility that the public would immediately gravitate toward her. That doesn't mean the other members would have been overshadowed or that ITZY couldn't have succeeded, but it could have changed the balance of the group. Instead of people discovering 5 members together, there might have been an immediate Somi and the other members narrative surrounding the group. And for a company trying to establish a brand new group with its own identity, that isn't necessarily ideal. Somi's personality and career also ended up making much more sense in hindsight as a soloist. Going solo gave her the freedom to build her own image, choose concepts that suited her, and develop an identity without having to fit into a 5-member group dynamic. At the same time, ITZY was able to establish its own identity without having one member arrive with an enormous pre-existing fanbase. So, in a strange way, both sides probably ended up where they needed to be. Somi got a solo career that allowed her to stand completely on her own. And ITZY got to develop as a group without one member automatically dominating the public's attention before they had even established themselves. But Somi wasn't the only trainee whose story could have turned out differently. Another name frequently brought up when discussing JYP's pre-debut trainee pool is Lily. Lily had already been associated with JYP for years before NMIXX eventually debuted. She had strong vocals, significant performance ability, and had been publicly known as a trainee long before she became an official idol. Because of that, fans naturally wondered whether she could have ended up in the company's next girl group. Again, it's important not to treat every pre-debut rumor as confirmed history. There isn't a simple official timeline showing that Lily was definitively selected for ITZY and then removed. What we do know is that she remained with JYP for years and eventually became part of NMIXX. And looking at that final outcome, it actually makes a lot of sense. ITZY's musical identity is heavily centered around performance, attitude, choreography, and high-energy songs. NMIXX, meanwhile, gave Lily much more room to demonstrate her vocal ability as one of the group's primary vocalists. In other words, the fact that Lily didn't end up in ITZY doesn't mean JYP had no idea what to do with her. It may have simply meant that there was another group where her particular strengths could become much more important. And that's one of the things people sometimes forget about the trainee system. Not making one lineup doesn't automatically mean someone wasn't good enough. Sometimes it means the company is trying to figure out where that person's abilities will have the biggest impact. Lily continued training under JYP for years and eventually debuted as a member of NMIXX in 2022. By that point, she had gone from being a long-time trainee whose future was uncertain to becoming one of the defining vocalists in a completely different group. And when you look at it that way, her story becomes less about missing out on ITZY and more about eventually finding the group that made better use of what she had to offer. Then there's Mashiro. Her connection to JYP's trainee system is particularly interesting because she actually spent around 2 years training at the company and was part of the same broader environment as several future ITZY members. As a Japanese trainee, she was also one of the international trainees who stood out within JYP's system. But when the final ITZY lineup was decided, Mashiro wasn't part of it. And once again, that could have been the end of the story. Instead, Mashiro decided to leave JYP and pursue another opportunity. She eventually appeared on Girls' Planet 999, putting herself through the survival show system all over again. Think about that for a moment. She had already spent years training. She had already experienced the uncertainty of waiting for a debut. She had already been passed over for one potential lineup. And then she willingly entered another survival show where she had to compete against dozens of other trainees for another chance. That's a pretty brutal way to pursue a career. But Mashiro performed consistently throughout the competition and gained a strong following of her own. She ultimately finished 8th and earned a place in the final lineup. She debuted as a member of Kepler, meaning that the trainee who once could have potentially been part of JYP's next girl group eventually found herself debuting under a completely different company with a completely different group after taking a completely different route. And her story didn't end there. After Kepler's initial contract period, Mashiro continued moving forward and eventually became a member of Madian. So instead of one debut, her career became a series of completely different chapters.
JYP trainee.
Girls' Planet 999 contestant. Kepler member. Madian member. That's an incredibly unusual journey, and it shows just how unpredictable the K-pop industry can be. Someone can spend years preparing for one specific debut, miss that opportunity, and still eventually find themselves standing on stage years later. And that's really the bigger story behind the trainees connected to ITZY. When fans look at a group after their debut, the lineup can feel inevitable. You see the 5 members together and think, of course this is ITZY. But before debut, nothing is inevitable. Companies are constantly evaluating trainees. Concepts change. Members leave. New trainees arrive. People who seemed like obvious debut candidates suddenly aren't there anymore. And sometimes someone who doesn't make one group eventually becomes a major star somewhere else. That's exactly what happened with several people connected to ITZY's pre-debut story. Somi went from being one of JYP's most recognizable trainees to becoming a successful soloist. Lily remained with JYP and eventually found her place in N-Mix, where her vocals could become one of the group's defining strengths. Mashiro left JYP, competed on Girls' Planet 999, debuted with Kepler, and later continued her career with Madian. None of those careers followed the path that fans might have expected when these trainees were still inside JYP. And that's what makes the what if so interesting. What if Somi had stayed? What if Lily had been placed in ITZY? What if Mashiro had made the final lineup? Would ITZY still have had the same sound? Would the group's concept have changed? Would the members have had the same roles? Would some of the songs we associate with ITZY have been performed by completely different voices? And perhaps the biggest question of all, would ITZY have become the same group we know today? There's no way to know. But that's the fascinating thing about pre-debut K-pop history. The final lineup is only one possible outcome from dozens of decisions that happen behind the scenes. Every trainee who gets cut represents an alternate version of the group that could have existed. And every trainee who leaves represents another possible timeline. ITZY's 5-member lineup eventually became one of the most recognizable girl group lineups of its generation. But it could have looked very different. Somi could have been there. Mashiro could have been there. Other trainees could have been there too. And if even one of those decisions had gone differently, the group we know today might have sounded, looked, and operated completely differently. That's what makes these pre-debut stories so fascinating. The idols we see on stage are only the final result. Behind them is a much larger group of trainees who practiced in the same rooms, attended the same evaluations, dreamed about the same debut, and sometimes came incredibly close to standing on that stage themselves. Some made it. Some didn't. Some disappeared. And some went somewhere completely different and became stars anyway. So when you look at ITZY now, it's worth remembering that this lineup wasn't simply waiting to happen. It was the result of years of decisions, changes, evaluations, and opportunities that could have gone in countless different directions. And somewhere in all those alternate timelines is a version of Itzy that looks completely different from the one we know. We just never got to see it.